some of the areas we're on. And I just have to check one thing real quick and make sure. I think one of the young techies came in and resolved an issue that I was an electronics issue, an equipment issue last week, and I want to thank them. Or it resolved itself? Nah, those things don't resolve themselves.
No.
Attorney. My big thing, Attorney Larry Altman, is just restart it. And if that doesn't resolve the issue or fix it, then I have to call somebody and get help.
Okay.
That's my go-to. Turn it off and turn it back on. Attorney Larry Altman, I'm delighted, honored, as always, to have you back on. Good morning.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm again recording from my favorite coffee shop, Revo Cup,
tell us.
Overland Park, Kansas, Town Center, where my host and hostess, Marve and Brandon, always treat me like family, and my two favorite baristas, Sarah and Lala, make the best coffee. And in fact, I think I shared with you a sign that Sarah created for the door of the office I'm in right now.
I love that. I appreciate that you sent it. It cracked me up. You're there frequently, obviously.
I'm here almost every day. This is my office.
I mean, really, that's where you go. And I get that. That's I
need coffee in the morning to re-energize me.
There was a place years ago that I used to go and work at. It was great environment, really nice people, and excellent coffee. What are you having this morning?
Oh, what I always have, a latte. Nothing changes. I'm very straightforward.
That's what you said.
It's hot today.
It's hot today. The difference. Yeah, right.
Because in the warm weather, it's cold. Wednesday, it's going to be 80 degrees here. It'll be cold on Wednesday.
80?
And then 20 on Thursday night.
That's very much like what happens here, what's been happening here with the weather. And I find it bizarre. It'll snow, light snow one day, and then be 70 some degrees a day or two later.
Yep. That's it here.
I've got to check the forecast here. I know it's going to be in the 70s, but 80. Wow. In November.
Yeah, in November. Well, close to 80. They don't know yet. It's the high 70s for sure.
Still, and right. So,
right.
A little bit more about your background.
All right. Well, I'm a retired attorney, originally from St. Louis, Missouri. My area that I worked in for the latter part of my career was working with students with disabilities, helped parents and children in their situations and problems with schools. 2011, I was hired by the Kansas City, Missouri Public School District, moved across the state to be in-house counsel, to be what we call the lead compliance officer for special education and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. They expanded my duties to be the Title IX coordinator and also to help with bullying problems and mental health issues with the school. About 9 years ago, we have a local university, Avila University in Kansas City, Missouri. I became an adjunct professor there, first with the School of Education, where I taught some graduate education classes and special ed. But for the last 7 years, I have been working with the business school, thanks to Dr. Wendy Aker, with undergraduate students. The class is called Introduction to Business Law, but we focus on anti-discrimination laws, civil rights, and diversity. And we start with the Constitution and we move forward and how that impacts business. I've written a couple of books about bullying and sexual harassment. I've published maybe 18 to 20 articles in various topics involving children. I've got 2 in the hopper that look like are going to be published soon, one on mental health.
Oh, wow.
Crisis in America, and a short version of another school safety paper. But I am working with a professor at the University of Colorado and a Kathy Randolph, and a professor from the University of Oklahoma, Brittany Hott, in writing a more expansive school safety paper where they will be adding in data from the educational point of view. And that article will be published most likely in educational magazines, so that with their data and research background and my legal writings, that we're doing a combined effort for that.
Wow. And the one a little bit more about the one that on the mental health crisis in America, because
yeah, sure. The one that I'm waiting to be published is that there was some research done by from 4 or 5 different agencies connected with the federal government about the impact COVID had upon our student population. And the data that they accumulated was frightening. What they determined was that, and they believe it's COVID related because we had schools closed, there wasn't much socialization, that when the children were returning to school, and even before, they had noticed a significant increase in, particularly with self-harm, that there was a large jump in 1 year of the number of young women that were going to the emergency room with attempts to hurt themselves or commit suicide, die by suicide. And it was 4 times the size of males, but it still both had increased. And they basically considered, and the Surgeon General of the United States believed that this was a crisis. We'd reached the point of crisis. And the next step was what we were going to do as a nation to face the issues and then bring some solutions to the table that might bring these numbers down. And then I learned yesterday, and I don't mean to be personal, is that my cousin's grandson, 22 years old, took his life.
Oh, I know
So-
saying sorry doesn't make it any, that's,
So that what I would say, and that doesn't do my cousin any good, but he was in college and who knows why. But if you looked at the readings, the publications I've read, yeah, I could probably surmise. I wonder what the link was. And unless also with all the issues of racism and the harm in the country, those kinds of things, I'm certain the pressure and the trauma contributed to that. I'm not a doctor or psychiatrist. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm obviously very stunned by this. But if I take off that hat and look at my research hat, I would say, well, why would I be stunned? It's not, the numbers would bear it, it might happen.
it's that's a tragic, just absolutely tragic suicides, and then anyone, but someone close, someone,
Yes.
and it becomes
Personal.
Yeah, personal. You understand it on a different level. And
Yes.
that crisis in America, and you think about how many, and again, I don't, you research this, I don't, but you can't help but to read the articles and see the numbers. And it's what, can we stay with this just for a minute? Do you mind?
Sure. No, absolutely. Because I sent you a link yesterday to research done by 3 college professors who published an article about school shootings.
Yeah.
And that we are now, as of this article was published shortly after the shooting that took place in St. Louis, my hometown.
Yeah.
And their numbers indicated that we've already set a record this year in October of the most school shootings in 1 year, and already had exceeded the previous record of 2021. And we've got 2 months to go.
No. Do you, underlying causes, and I know there's a lot, you can't certainly say there's not one cause, there's not one issue that people are having, but what, when people talk about social media and how that contributes, et cetera, do you have any thoughts about?
Well, yeah, I do. I mean, again, it's based on research. Understand, for the listening audience, I'm an attorney. I am not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist, but I do a lot of research, which is required, which I believe is part of my duties. Duties.
That's your disclaimer, as we would.
That's my disclaimer.
That's your disclaimer.
Part of my duties, not only when I was working in Kansas City, Missouri public schools, but to my students. I owe it to them to give them the most recent information. And the only way you do that is by studying and research. So you read that in the recent publications that, and let's go back again, we talk about that we've set a record. That's a record we don't want to have.
Yeah.
But then you go back to 2018 and 2019, and the United States Secret Service talked about the problems. In 2019, which was their follow-up to the 2018 publication of how to improve school safety, their research showed that 80%, let's underline that, 80% of school violence and or self-harm is related to bullying. So that would indicate, based upon their research, that if we have a student who has committed an act of violence against others in school, or has either taken their life or has attempted to harm themselves, that 4 out of 5 of those they could trace back to bullying. And that's why they advocated, and this is a phrase people in the education field don't like, no tolerance for bullying. And the phrase is not like, and I understand that having been in an inner city school, the concern is that when you talk about zero tolerance, that it will impact students, either the data would show students of disability or students of color to a higher percentage than white students. And there's no doubt there's data to support that. I'm not disputing that. But at the same time, what it means is if you're worried about an overusage of the no tolerance and bullying, and you then you collect data to make sure you're not doing that, is that you make sure that you're across the board, your policies, protocols, and procedures are being implemented without any reference to color, gender identity, gender, whatever. You just do it. Here are your plans. You implement it. You collect data to make sure you're not taking a factor into account you should not be.
Frightening as it continues, and you think about this and the research that you're doing, and I don't want to say, yeah, I don't want to say. It's horrifying. And the article that you sent is just, talk with us a little bit more. You talked about bullying, Attorney Altman, and some of the cases that you've been able to look at of school shootings that fit some of the information that's been out there, what to look for.
Well, there have been, when you look at some of the incidents, and we're still looking because we wait for full-blown reports from various aspects when there's a school shooting. But one that comes to my attention was a case in Texas last year where in a high school, a student brought a gun to school and shot 3 of his classmates. The story goes, and there was documents to prove this, is that he was being bullied by these 3 students, that the school was on notice of it. The school had video to support the claims and yet took no action. So what the shooter did to protect himself was took things into his own hands and brought a gun. Now, let's go back to the Secret Service publications of 2018 and 19. They would say that a contributing cause to this is when schools do not step in when they are aware of a bullying incident, and the outcome is going to be not good. And so that fit right into what they predicted would occur. And it's interesting, I've done continuing research to find out what happened to the shooter, and there's virtually nothing published. And I'm wondering if even charges were brought against the student, when in fact he was doing what he would be considered self-defense. There's just been no follow-up. Going back further, even before the Secret Service established this, 2016, the state of Missouri updated its bullying statute for schools. And this was in response to a young lady who was being bullied and harassed online. And the school was aware of it, didn't take any steps, and the young lady thought that her only solution was to take her life. When that took place, the Missouri legislature then took immediate steps. And just let's put the dynamics of the politics aside for a moment. For those people that aren't aware of Missouri, Missouri is what you would call a red state, very Republican. We have a Republican conservative legislature who immediately went into action and revised and updated and expanded bullying protection to include online bullying. It passed virtually with no opposition, signed into by the governor almost immediately. And who even talked about politics? No one cared. A child had died. And the government who had the responsibility to take action because schools were not, took action. And now in Missouri, you've got a multifaceted statute since 2016 that requires schools to take affirmative action or find themselves out of compliance with a state statute. So 2 primary examples that I just support, and that was before the Secret Service's 2019 bullying has to be stopped. I'm wondering if they did not research that Missouri case and include that in their data computation, say, here's what we're talking about.
The failure of the nation to deal with it, because you've developed, Attorney Altman, some real good plans on how to do it, but the schools have to be proactive.
Yes.
Not to, what are the things that they're looking for? Do you want to address that a little bit?
Sure. If you go
Signs.
back again to the suggestions of the Secret Service in their 2018, that's in my book, is that what they're looking for, the team is looking for, is not only bullying as a potential cause, but let's go to COVID, for example. What we know is that trauma of any type, and bullying being one of those issues, trauma can impact a student, and it impacts students in different ways. Every child is an individual. That's why one of the federal laws is called the Individual Disability Education Act. It doesn't say the Group Disability Education Act. So what the psychologists and psychiatrists are telling us is that if a traumatic event takes place in a child's life, how that child processes it may be of critical importance. So let's go to COVID. A child is in a home. They're not in school for a period of time, and during that period of time, a family member, God forbid, dies. Or family members or the family they live in, parents lose their job, there's no food at home, or they're kicked out of their house or apartment because of non-payment. That trauma is another event we look at to determine whether or not that this now child is walking towards a path of saying, I have no other recourse but either hurting myself or others to get back at people, especially when I come back in school and see that some of my teammates are floating around happy as little campers. Third thing, what about grades? Are we seeing a student who was once a very good student all of a sudden dropping significantly in grades? That would be a potential warning sign. Another thing is just the student's overall demeanor. Student who once was happy, carefree, whatever, all of a sudden becomes very withdrawn, has crying fits, is in the counselor's office. There's not one specific item that would, but it's adding those together. What is, if you add all those components together, what do you get? And so this is what the Secret Service talks about, and what I advocate, and my colleagues in Colorado and Oklahoma, what we advocate is why each school has to put nuances into their own policies to adjust for their own group of kids that they have there. This is not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
I could go to one school and have one suggestion, then collect data and say it won't work in school B for whatever reason. But it does require some basics. And what we're seeing is a failure across the board, that it's not done enough. And I think today I sent you, my colleague, Dr. Randolph, sent me an article out of Colorado, which is her home state, where the state has a report mechanism for anybody who's of concern across the state. So they have a statewide issue, but doesn't apply only to schools. But when you look at that, that's a beginning point. At least the state has recognized that there may be some issues with some of their citizens, but then what you do with that information still becomes critical. And we found out in St. Louis, by the way, what they did with the information wasn't very good. They knew they had a kiddo that had a gun, reported it, it was confiscated, and lo and behold, somehow he gets the gun back, and then he appears in his old school building, breaks the window, comes in, and kills 2 people, and would have killed more but for the fact that his gun jammed and that the police were there, unlike Uvalde, within 3 minutes.
When you say that about the problem, I've always said everybody probably says it's easy to identify the problem. It's a solution that's challenging.
No doubt.
We see that with this. It's, again, identifying it. And what you're talking about in more depth about watching the grades, watching the behaviors, traumatic event in their life that someone may or may not know about it. Someone's being hurt at home or elsewhere. They may not know about it, certainly at school, but you can start looking at some of them. Like, again, when you said, Attorney Altman, the grades, it's great if grades go up, but if it seems unusual that they're starting to drop, such as a B student's now getting D's.
That's something you would look for.
Something
that just doesn't fit what I call what's driving the engine. And there is not one easy answer. I mean, the article that I sent you this morning from my colleague in Colorado, from the article I sent you published shortly after the St. Louis shooting, written by 3 professors, they again go to a combination of solutions to be added together. Now, they spend most of their time on the issue that is the political hot button, is gun control, gun issues, too many guns. I've got that. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that. I understand that, but I also understand the politics of it. And then they put in one paragraph about prevention. Now, I would have preferred more expansion of that, but it's going to take, let's first get out. If it's, you and I know, because we're in our 40s or 50s or something like that.
Something like
We've been told how important exercise and diet is if we want to live longer, right? So we want to prevent heart disease. We want to prevent high blood pressure. One of the suggestions that has been in for years, we need to eat better. We need to exercise. It's called preventive measures. It's why my son, one of my sons is a cancer research guy. One of the things he insists on for me is an annual PSA test. Why? He wants to get out in front, because if I don't have a PSA test and then I get to the tail end, I'm dead, basically. It's preventive, but it's a combination. That doesn't mean you're not going to get sick.
sure.
Doesn't mean we're not going to have shootings. But if we get out in front and maybe prevent some, maybe we lessen the number of shootings and we get under that record number that we don't want to be. So you've got to work together. And again, I know this may not be politically correct for all of your artists, but the bottom line is it takes a village. It really does. Society has to come together and decide, we have had enough. And yes, we can talk about the school debate. I got that. That's important. But let's go back to the very beginning. What do we do to prevent it? And this comes back up, by the way, this year, about 2 months ago, the Department of Education published lengthy articles about how students with disabilities were being disciplined more frequently and illegally than their non-disabled peers. They spent one of their papers discussing, why don't we focus on preventing the misbehaviors so that we don't have to get to the point that we actually have to discipline. And that paper is in draft form, and one of these days I hope to get it published. It's a preventive measure. It's the same thing we do for our hearts. And when we don't smoke anymore, or we're not supposed to, preventing cancer. And that's the same thought we have to give here.
And that's a great, I like how you say that about the PSA, for example. Earliest detection, best possible outcome. Doesn't mean it's going to be a cure. But
Correct.
You've got to know what's coming or what you're dealing with, and you have a better opportunity. And this way, with the prevention of the school violence, et cetera, the shootings, et cetera, you of course, you'll never know what you're preventing. Just like exercising, I don't know, maybe genetically, whatever. And I agree with you. We need to certainly have better diets and more exercise. Yet something like this could be, if accepted, if people will do it. That's part of the issue. Again, when you talk about prevention, Attorney Altman, you've got to get people motivated to do something so that we're not, I don't want to say I never become numb to school shootings, yet it's when we say another one, what just happened, and preventing that by, again, observing multifaceted approach.
And that's absolutely right. And because look at what's at stake. I mean, here we go. We've got a school in St. Louis City. And as I said, I know exactly where there was. I lived there all my life. Not far from the hospital that my son and my good friend in cardiology at Washington University, it's within a couple miles of that hospital. Look at what let me step. That's a terrible start. Again, let's go back to what research shows. After Parkland, I had published an article that talked about the bystander effect based upon, again, clinical studies by psychiatrists. This is not Larry Altman talking about this, but what the clinical studies showed by these outstanding doctors and PhD doctors and medical doctors was that those who observed or were in the building at Parkland or any such event, even though, thank God, they were not personally hurt, the trauma of the situation would produce the same psychological problems as others are in some ways those who got shot and wounded, not the ones that are killed. I obviously have got that. But the bystanders suffered from significant mental health issues that would accelerate down the line if not properly addressed. What do we hear about when we read about a school shooting? The school announces, and tomorrow morning we'll have counselors in the building to help there, to meet with the children and meet with the families and the staff, because we know they've been traumatized. Well, all right, let's go back, and I think we've talked about this before. Again, if we prevent that from happening and spend that money over here in the prevention side, not only will we do great favors in helping with the mental health and the safety of the children there now, but we don't have the future expense of bringing in professionals who now have to deal with a student body. In addition, what is sometimes overlooked is that it's not just the bystander effect, it's also something called, again, these are the professionals, something called the anniversary effect. That on the anniversary of an event like this, it's relived. There have been articles published about parents at Sandy Hook who, even 5 and 6 years later after their child died, took their lives because of they missed their child so much they couldn't go on any further. That's called the anniversary effect. I have seen that in investigations, not in school shootings, but in incidents of sexual harassment and violence. When there was a delay in investigating the problem, I was called in as the Title IX investigator, total ignorance of their own policies, and we'd already reached 1 year, and the victim took a nosedive psychologically. I sort of knew the answer to this beforehand, but I interviewed the psychiatrist. And I said, is this not a classic example of the anniversary effect? Absolutely right. We've now reached the anniversary. There was no outcome a year ago, and now she's basically having nightmares again. All of this is the long-range impact if by what we're doing now of improving schools, locking schools down. I got it. But if we just took some time to go and prevent the incident, think of all those bad later things that we won't have to deal with. Now we need to collect data to prove I'm right, and we haven't done enough school work to do it. I am basing that upon a prediction and opinion from the United States Secret Service. I admit that.
When Attorney Altman, that the Secret Service report that again was published a number of years ago, why do you think, in your opinion, that it's not more, what do we want to say, recognized, utilized, the information from that?
If I had an answer to that, I would give you, I'm purely speculating. In one of my papers, I talk about, well, it's too expensive, it's too time consuming. I've talked about that. I've talked about, even when I talk about it today, the answer is, well, Larry, you know about this, but what happens when you die and nobody does it and advocates for it anymore? It'll end up going down the toilet, whatever. You're in a dream world, because only a few people are going to follow your suggestions. And I don't know, is it because, let's hope this is not the case. Is it because in 2018, the Secretary of Education at that time was not highly regarded? And she's the one that signed off on it. Are people downplaying it because that Secretary of Education, who was not highly regarded, signed off on it? I don't know if that's factual or not, but I do know, being around educators, being around educators, she was never highly regarded. But so what? The paper, the research was outstanding. How do I ignore that? I don't care that she signed off on it or not. I could care less, or that it was addressed to number 45. That's how the report was addressed. I don't care about that. I want to know what was written, and what is written makes sense to me, because we had used a similar plan in preventing sexual harassment, bullying, and mental health issues when I was at Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools. So I at least know there it worked.
Attorney Altman, when you say that about someone not highly regarded, that's a concern because of the political atmosphere. Because again, like you say, Second Amendment, that it polarizes people, because there might be something that we can do regarding the Second Amendment. I'm not advocating, I'm stating, then everything else is no good. If somebody says, well, we need to make sure that kids don't get their hands on gun, this is how we're going to do it, this is what we propose, then everything else in the report is going to be negated, because people feel that with the current political environment. I don't know if I'm making
No,
sense.
no, you're right. And that's what made the
That's
two
kind of-
reports from the Secret Service so brilliant. There is not a word of discussion about guns. Nothing. So you've taken that out of the equation. So if you read their materials and you're looking to see about gun control, there's nothing there. Well, it makes perfect sense. At that time, that administration wasn't going to go down that rabbit hole. So they did something that avoids the great pushback. There's nothing in there about gun control. It's all about prevention, not so much guns, not even a word about what do we see about a child? How do we look at this child? And I don't mean to criticize the report from the three professors. That was very well written. But when they start talking about guns, I'm going to make a guess here. Again, I have no evidence of that. It's immediately going to turn somebody off because how dare you touch my Second Amendment rights? And then in the middle of it has a paragraph about prevention. You've missed, as I would say, you've missed the point. The point being, let's talk about prevention. There's enough stuff out there about locking down schools, guns and stuff. And we need to have that debate. That's what it's about.
Certainly.
But let's focus on something that doesn't talk about guns. Let's talk about prevention. Let's step in so that we don't have to argue about Second Amendment rights. We are talking now about school safety. And we're talking of it in such a way that we need to help our children deal with trauma, bullying, all those things that we have some control over if we handle policies properly. And yet we don't have to go into the debate about, well, you're talking about the Second Amendment. How dare me give up my gun? Nope, nothing in there about it. Find it in my papers. You don't see a word about guns in my papers.
And again, like you say guessing. I'm certain that does, because we see it all the time with people immediately turned off by something, or they won't read further, or they won't talk about it, or they're going to yell about, like you said, the Second Amendment rights. That's what we need. That's the coming together.
Yes. And with all due respect, thoughts and prayers are great. How many, somebody's not listening here because the person with the gun's not listening to thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
It comes back to a movie, and I think I've shared this with you before, called Kingdom of Heaven, where the monk tells Orlando Bloom that is that what God expects of everybody is, and he points to his head and his heart, and you can elect to do good or not. Well, okay, if the person is going to want to do violence, that's not good. And so the question is, how do you prevent that person, whether it's his or her fault, whatever, what's driving the engine, how do you prevent it from getting that far? How do you prevent somebody at 22 years old taking their lives? How do you prevent that? Is there something, and now you're beating yourself up? Did we know about this? Were there signs? And who writes about that very well in his book is the congressman from Maryland, and I'm blanking out his name, who wrote a book, and he's on the 1-6 committee, who talks about his son. Tommy is the name of his son, who took his life weeks before the January 6th rebellion at the Washington in the government. He said, what did I miss? That's the problem you have also. And so when you, in a school environment, you may have some opportunities to pick up on some things that might, if the community is working together, help this youngster get help so we don't get to the ultimate step. And as I said, I think I shared with you last time that I believe that our program worked at Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools, working with one of our local hospitals. We developed a check sheet. We got the check sheet. The signs were there. And we then worked with the parents, and the parents worked with the hospital. And then over a course of a year, our superintendent gets two different letters from two different mental health care providers saying your prompt action may have saved this child's life. Okay. So my question is, yes, we put a lot of time and effort in it, and I guess that's money. Ask those parents, was that money well spent?
We did talk about that. And I'd like you to talk a little bit, for some folks that first time hearing you, a little bit more about that program because of that. But again, that regret with suicide, that I've always, when I think about it, everybody's going to say, like you said, what didn't I hear? What didn't I notice? I should have called. He called me yesterday, and maybe if I had called him back, I mean, that's hellish hell for people to wonder what they didn't see.
And I went through that personally. I went that through personally many years ago. Knew a young lawyer when we were both young. I was a little older, and he had had a run-in with the Missouri bar, and brilliant lawyer, and went to Florida for a period of time. And he comes back, and he and I were both mentored by a very good judge by the name of Judge Ken Romines, who I'm sad to report died last month. Judge Romines calls me and says, and he says, "Hey, our buddy is back. Get over here." And so I go over there, and we're high fives, hugging each other. He had come to my house a couple of times. My children were there young. They loved him. He always played with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we made plans to get together the next day so that he could come back into the legal practice. And he said, "Larry, I'll talk to you later." And that night he took his life. He was saying goodbye to us.
Yeah.
He was telling us goodbye. And I remember how much I punished myself for not noticing that. And professionals said, "You're not trained to notice those things, but you have that regret." So let's fast forward to the Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools, working with them, with the hospital, and with a checklist that had been developed by the suicide prevention experts. We had a checklist. And if we found the checklist, whatever, the report hit my desk. We had a procedure and policies in place of where it would go next. And then we followed everything along the line. And my job was to follow up as the quote overall supervisor, whatever, of those programs. So we developed policies based upon the help given us by a hospital professional group who got materials from the suicide prevention groups, and we implemented it without fail every time. And I guess the outcome, as I said, at least we know twice it must have worked. Great, we did it.
You'll never know what else might have worked, what else with that program, how many other kids, correct?
There's no way of knowing this.
Yeah.
And the other complaint pushback I get is government intervention. And I hear you on that. Look, having worked for a public school, the last thing I like is these federal regulations that make us do all these things day in, day out. But there was a solution to it. If we had done our job in the first place, there wouldn't have been a need for regulation and a regulatory body to come in and beat on us. Let's go back to Missouri. The child who took her life when the bullying policy was very narrowly written. Well, come on. As I understand in the research, what they found in their legislative investigation, the school knew all about it. And they had a policy. The state statute says you got to prevent bullying. Admittedly, it was very broad-based. But the school ignored it. What's the outcome? The state legislature says, okay, since you guys can't figure it out on yourself, we're going to put all these requirements and make it mandatory under state law. Gee, are you happy now? I mean, that's my response. Are you happy now? You didn't do your job. One of you nimnuts didn't do it. There's a dead child. Somehow it was connected to a legislator who was very powerful up there in Missouri. And I know where the location of everybody was in this situation. And I suspect, no evidence, that it was a family member or a good friend of the family whose child died, and then said, that's enough. We're going to pass a law. Now what do we got? We got Missouri human rights people, the Missouri legislature is looking, the Department of Education is now looking down you every school, even if you were already doing it, and now saying you got to run us by us all the time. Now, it doesn't get that strict, but it's because somebody wasn't paying attention. And that's what the outcome is. The last thing I want to see here is, do we really want the Department of Education to start issuing regulations that says you're going to do this no matter what, without consideration of the cost, without consideration that we got to get you more help? Is that really what we want? And my answer is no. Why don't we be proactive, as every school district be proactive, work within our budget, talk to our community leaders, say, look, we don't want the feds here. Let's just do it.
When you say that, I know that in past conversations we've had, and I just got a couple of emails about what you're saying in the last 10 or 15 minutes about government overreach. And that's what I'd say turns people off.
Right.
Government's going to dictate, well, if we take hold of it, then that won't happen if we will be proactive. But again, that's something to legislate, that people get, and the costs, like you say, the cost, Attorney Altman, et cetera, that they push back on. It's like, no, it's more government involvement in life. They're going to be tracking our kids. They're going to be, and I understand the concern. Not saying I agree. I understand the concern that people have with, I'm very libertarian in my thoughts, so we're not going to get political, but less government involvement in our personal lives. I understand that. That's why they need to be proactive. Again,
Yeah,
that's
I don't
exactly.
I don't want them here. I don't
Yeah,
want a Department of Education Office of Civil Rights people. I used to jokingly, and they even laugh and chuckle this, is I called them the red ants. Once you get them in, you can't get them out. And so, and even the head of the Kansas City, when I made that announcement, we were talking about Title IX and why we wanted to do all these preventive steps. Now it was regulated. But I reminded my colleagues across the state, look, folks, we better be doing this, because once these guys get into your building, there's no fumigation. They're red ants. And you just sit there. And if for those that don't want government involvement, the Secret Service documents are not regulations. They are suggestions.
Yeah.
They're well thought out, in my opinion. If you implement them, and enough schools around the country implement, and the data starts showing that school shootings, school violence decrease, well, Congress may just say, yeah, we got other things to do today. We're not going to regulate or issue a statute in this or expand one of our federal laws to take this into account. Look, we've already got warnings in the area of students with disabilities starting in 2011, and then reading again today, that if you have a student with disability who's bullied or sexual harassed, you got to take all these steps or else. There's the regulatory body in our schools. And if you don't do that, I've read those more rulings from these folks. Now you got a problem, because now they're going to be in your school for 3 to 5 years monitoring everything you do. Man, I don't want to go down that. Why don't we just stop it now and get it done?
And about the students with disabilities, there's a local comedian, wonderful, wonderful young man, and he's in an electric wheelchair. He's actually shared a while back a story of some guy bullying. I couldn't even comprehend that someone would bully someone who's disabled. And he said, I'm going to pick you up out of that chair. And, it's like, Matt, what? He said, and of course, he's a wonderful comedian. I call him a kid. He is a kid to guys like you and I. But the thought of that, and he makes a joke of it, of course, but it's incomprehensible. Yet, and then you see that, and I certainly could understand, and you see the pattern. That's traumatic. Not only do you have the disability that you have to deal with, then you have bullying, and it's.
Well, a young man out of Europe may have just cost himself a National Hockey League career. The Boston Bruins were signing this one great phenom out of Europe. Then they did a research in his background, is that 3 years ago, he was actually convicted of a misdemeanor in Europe of bullying and harassing people with disabilities. And even after the conviction, he continued to harass and berate people with disabilities. The National Hockey League then said, he can't come into our league, and they voided the contract. We want more information. We're not going to put a bully in our league. That took a lot of courage, and it sent the correct message there.
Sure.
Next week, for example, a week from Tuesday, in my class, because we talk about disability discrimination in the employment workplace, I am bringing in a gentleman who I meet at the coffee shop who is blind. And his wife will drive him, and he's a professor, he's a reverend. He's going to discuss with my students the issues that he's come up against. And in addition, he's a man of color. So he's got two things that are target zones. And my students need to hear, so that when they do their planning if their plan for their project, how will they address it to make sure that gentleman is welcome in his business, in their business, and or if wants to work there, is welcome as a employee without having to worry about being discriminated because of his blindness. I mean, that's the importance of my class. And I also remind them that one of my former great mentors, Judge Rick Titleman of the Missouri Supreme Court, was legally blind, and yet he reached all the way and became the presiding judge of the Missouri Supreme Court. He came through an era when there were no protections. And he just another motivation for my wife and I to continue our work in this field, because he wanted it done and he was proud that we would do it.
It's fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking with attorney Lawrence Altman. When you, with some of that, again, with the disabilities, with the bully, and we've talked a lot about it this before, but what makes the bully? What, and again, I'm not excusing, certainly not. What do we know about what would be, I'm thinking again about this kid, what would make this big guy bully a kid in a wheelchair?
Well, again, I'm not a clinical
Yeah, I
psychologist in those
understand,
things.
but you've
I
done
can
a
go by
lot of
it.
research.
Is that you go through and read things that bullies like power and able to intimidate. If there's someone who is, quote, they perceive to be weaker than they are, not able to defend for themselves, that's an easy target for bullies. There is actually a TV ad that talks about how these people will pick on some youngster. But in this article, there is another youngster who steps on to defend the victim. And then the bullies back down. And showing again, see it, report it, help. And it's a TV ad. I said it's really well done. One of the targets for being different. Again, the data shows members of the LGBT community are victimized, highly victimized by others for being who they are. We've seen that. So again, it's a matter of power. When we go through the structure, what constitutes bullying, what we look is one of the things we look at is what we call an unfair advantage. And if I'm able to walk and run, and there's a child who is in a wheelchair, and I punch that child in a wheelchair, especially if I go diving down the steps, isn't going to be able to hustle after me to defend themselves. Or, and I hope they don't do this anymore, the child is hearing impaired, somebody will sneak up behind them and their buddy will push them over the kid who's behind them so they fall over backwards. I've seen that. What's the fun of that? It's power. It's I'm more powerful than you. And again, this is just reading articles of what makes a bully and why they do it.
You know, I've got to, I'm going to find this cartoon. There's a wonderful author in Canada that does a cartoon, Rabbit and Bear, which actually are both her comforting herself about things and dealing with issues. And she's got one. I've got to find it, and I'll send it to you and I'll post it up. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
What do you do? Well, what won't they attack me too or something? And you get other people to defend about the bullying issue. And
yes.
Again, kids can be put in a tough situation with that, because imperative that you stand up. But who's the first one that's going to stand up for the kid getting bullied, especially when it's someone more powerful, bigger, whatever, stronger, or with other people, other bullies. Something that we have to deal with, something that we have to figure out. Again, never an excuse for if somebody was bullied or the parents were harsh or whatever to bully someone else. We've got to recognize these things. And I ask you this all the time, Attorney Altman, what continues to drive you?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well,
you and your wife to continue.
We have 2 grandchildren, and and they live in St. Louis. After the school shooting a couple of weeks ago in St. Louis, we Skype every week with their dad and my grandchildren. And my first grade grandson says, well, Grandpa, I made some comment about, because Mike I knew was in the hospital not far from the shooting, and my first grade grandson, oh, Grandpa, we went through all sorts of neat things. We went into a locked room and this and this, and said it was all because of the shooting. First grade. I'm sorry. That's wrong. That's just so. If you want to know what continues to motivate us, that young man, his 3-year-old sister, I don't want them living in this world. Neither does my wife. It's wrong. And there are better, more first grade kiddos at that age need to be in the classroom learning, and they need to feel safe. They don't. And so that's what drives us now. How do we make it safer?
Get with that, to think of the kids, the little one telling you that, your little grandson telling you that.
I was
And that's,
heartbroken. So was grandma, my wife. We were
oh, I'm
just
sure.
heartbroken.
Almost brings me thinking
It
about
did.
that.
I was just shaking my head, Louis, for that. And even talking to you about it now, I'm just shaking my head. I worry every day about him going to school now and wondering, am I going to read something from St. Louis today? Because across the street from them is the high school that I went to. And I know they have issues that, thank God, Washington University stepped in and helped. But they're across the street from the high school.
It's terrifying.
It just scares the daylights out of my wife and I.
Yeah, every day, just glad when he's home. When he's, oh, that's horrific to think.
Yes.
And he's when he was telling you, if you don't mind, he was
sort of happy about it. He thought it was fun.
Excited, yeah.
But he doesn't understand the seriousness of that.
Of course.
Because they made it fun for them. But it's not.
It's not, yeah.
And to say, well, it'll never happen in a K-5 environment. Well, then tell me why in Boston a couple weeks ago, a first grader brought a knife to school. And they confiscated it. Why did the child bring the knife? We never hear any more about it. I'd be curious to know if the child had been bullied. What's going on in the school environment?
There's something, obviously, something.
I mean, I've had a child when I was at Kansas City, who brought a knife to school. We looked into it. The child was autistic, and I think I've told you the story. It was because mom was a single parent. Mom was packing lunches. The child would only eat the sandwich if it was diagonally cut. To help mom, the child brought the knife to school to cut her sandwich. All right, we got into that. We found out the reason. There's no discipline for that. And then we developed a plan so that the child wouldn't have to bring the knife to school. How hard was that? All right, I got that. Was that the same case in Boston? I don't know.
I don't know. That's the problem.
That's right.
You don't know.
Right.
Something that, yeah. And again, the young kids, any kids, forgive me for saying it like that, but to think about it, getting to that point. And the grandson telling you again, it's fun. Sure, they made it fun. They made it as upbeat. They don't want to start screaming at him. We got to get in there locked room, things like that. Yet, as they get older, they will understand more about it.
That's true.
You
got to talk about it now. But there are better things for first graders to do.
I agree. Of course, you don't want them to think about that, worry about it, dwell on it. Makes me harken back to, and you probably too, getting under our desk when there was if the bomb falls. I mean, I remember if we get under your desk, and I was just talking with a friend of mine about this the other day, and some kids where they put their heads against the wall in the hall or something now, or about that.
Look remember, you and I probably were around the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Oh yeah, I was.
My wife lived in Silver Springs, Maryland. What they were required to do was run home from school and call the school and find out how long it took for them to run home. Now, turns out if the bombs had hit DC, they wouldn't have made it. In my school in St. Louis, you're right. It was called, if the sirens went off, get under the desk. I remember those days. Wasn't fun. I thought it was then.
We did, yeah.
We thought, hey, this is cool, right? And then we go back and look and say, oh my God.
Yeah,
it wasn't fun. It was serious.
Yeah.
But think about my poor wife, 11 years old, having to run home from school.
And then
have her parents call the school and say, what time they left school to so-and-so, what time is she there? And then she learns that she would not have made it if the bombs had hit DC, if they'd been launched from Cuba. Think about that. I remember those days. And that's what we're going through now with the school shootings, folks. For those of you that weren't around the Cuban Missile Crisis, been there, done that. You don't want to be doing this.
No, you don't want to be doing it, the kids. So where are you at with things? Well,
I'm waiting.
I know you're, go ahead.
I've got one of my friends is going to publish a short version of the article, the two I told you about. I just heard back from Kathy Randolph out of Colorado. We are very close to a final product for that will be headed to educational magazines. And Louis, when they're published, I will send anything I publish,
Please.
you'll get. And
Thank
you
you.
feel free to share that with your on-air people or post it, whatever. So I've got those three things near completion, and then
And you'll
I'm
come
also
back and
working.
talk about those. Forgive me for interrupting.
I'm honored anytime you want me to talk about anything I write. It's an honor and privilege. We're also working on a project for autistic children with Dr. Randolph and Dr. Hott, of improving, helping children who are autistic, helping schools understand there's better ways of helping these children. And they're doing the educational component, and I'm honored that they're asking me to give them the legal backing of what the law requires us to do. That's a long-term project. I'll share all those things with you and your audience until you tell me don't send it.
No, I'll never tell you that. I'm never going to say don't send it. I'm never going to say, because again, this is something that's obviously getting worse. You know, when
Yes.
the one article that you said, obviously getting worse. Fear is, of course, concern, I should say, for you, for me, for a lot of people, is people kind of getting, oh, another school shooting, oh, another, or it happens somewhere else. It doesn't happen here until it happens here. Makes me think of an old Frank Zappa song, Mothers of Invention. It can't happen here. And certainly when you think about the prevention aspect, something we need to all get involved in, whether you've got grandchildren, whether you've got kids, regardless, for the safety of the nation, the sanity of the nation, for, again, you and I, Attorney Altman, I'm more progressed into my senior years than you are. Nonetheless,
I doubt that, but go ahead.
no, I'm gonna look online. I'm pretty sure I'm correct on that. Again, knowing that how that progresses and that happens, and we're talking about it today from the 60s, the early 60s. Where are things going to be?
Well, you and I don't know the answer to that.
Certainly,
but
certainly.
But by you having me on this program and doing what my wife and I do, we're sure trying to make things better for those two grandchildren of mine. And others who are at the coffee shop. I just saw a little 6-week-old baby. I got to make it better for that 6-week-old baby.
Where do you think that comes from in you? I understand with your grandchildren, but this was before you were involved in this, way before you had grandkids, and I just you pointing to it now.
I think I didn't have the best childhood in the world. Let's put it to you that way. All right. I don't want to go into any more detail than that. And so the childhood I had was horrific. I had one supporter back then, and may he rest in peace. It was my pediatrician, George Sato, who probably saved my life more than once and saw something in me that no one else did and thought I was worth saving. I then married the beautiful Gail Capper Altman, who saw the same thing, and I don't know what she saw either. And then, as I said, as I started practicing law, I really didn't like it, and then realized, she said, as she was working with disabled students, hearing impaired students primarily, hit about 45, 50, she says, you know, I think you do better working with students with disabilities. And I immediately fell in love with it because I recognized that was me. But for the grace of God, that was me. And so that's it.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing that. We've got to talk about, I've had you have another 2 minutes?
Sure.
Real quick story. I've had a guest on that wrote a book called El Defo. They actually made a cartoon about it now, and it's a young lady, the difficulty she had in school, with being hearing impaired. And it was interesting because I initially had her husband on, who's on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, who has written books and cartoon books that have sold around the world. And his wife came on with me once, but she reads lips. And it was interesting because I had to make sure that I had the mic to the side, that I didn't have it with the windscreen on and everything. It's fascinating. I've got to talk with you about that. Your wife got to maybe connect.
She would tell you that's part of what you have to do. And by the way, she's given me a list of things, because my students have also asked me how to interact with employees and customers who are hearing impaired. And she's given me a list of things for me to cover with them.
You're an amazing. I'd love to have your wife on sometime, by the way.
It'd be great.
No.
You'd enjoy her more than me.
No,
She's
I
prettier
no.
than I am.
Well, that's yeah, but I love talking with you, and I'm honored to know you.
The honor's all mine.
And sometime, and again, live from. Tell us where
Pardon me?
your
Oh,
office is.
Revo Cup Town Center, Overland Park, Kansas. Marve and Brandon are the host, and Sarah and Lala are the great baristas here who make my coffee every day.
Every day at your office,
And then they have to put up, with my dad jokes in exchange.
Oh, that's right. Do you have a new one for us?
I can't remember which one I told you the last time, so I'm thinking maybe try this one. Is that a friend of mine just had a nephew? I said, John, what are they going to call the nephew? He said, Larry, they've had a big fight over it. So they tossed a coin and they decided to call the child Tails.
You crack me up with dad jokes. We've got to get them in sometime. Some of one of the baristas or something. When we start,
if they're not busy, I tell them they ought to stop in, but they don't want to come in. I'll have to tell them
they don't.
one of these times they have to come by when we do this
tell
again.
Them, just at the beginning, just
okay,
so we can say hi. I would love that. I would love that.
All right, we'll get it done.
We'll do it. We'll do it again soon.
Great, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's an honor and privilege to you and all all those listeners.
I'm just the conduit. You're the one. The honor.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Incredibly important things, folks. Again, I know I'm a little off today. Attorney Larry Altman, but thanks for noticing. I got some emails. Thanks for noticing. But the important